What's good, mini crafters? My name is Samuel and this is my very first YouTube video. I love to paint minis, make dioramas, and do a few other hobby projects as well. I wanted to start off with something nice and easy, so I'm going to be showing you how you can make your own brick or stone wall out of just a piece of styrofoam. So, grab your favorite snack, sit back, and enjoy the episode. Many times when I'm looking to elevate a diorama, one of the first things I think to add is a brick or stone wall. And while this might seem like a really simple thing to add, it actually can bring a lot of visual interest into your diorama and bring it to that next level. Plus, it's really easy to do. Let's jump into some of the materials that you're going to need to build your own wall, along with showing you some of the steps that I use to make mine. First, let's look at some materials that you're going to need to make this. Some of these are essentials, but I'm also going to mention a few extras that aren't really necessary, but could be helpful in getting started. The first thing that we're going to need is styrofoam. What? You need styrofoam for a styrofoam wall? This type of foam is rigid and is commonly used in construction, packaging, and other applications. It has a smooth, dense surface and a closed-cell structure. I know many people ask about the white pellet-style packing foam that's even more common, and I've tried messing with this to use for etching and foam scribing, but it's much messier and it doesn't cut as easily. Not to mention it leaves a big mess to clean up. Another tool that you're going to need for this is a hobby knife or an X-Acto knife. There are tons of options here and each have their uses. I have a short-handled orange knife that fits in my hand more comfortably. I also have another that I can extend out to adjust to the length that I need. But when it comes to mini crafting, I usually stick with the tried and true normal X-Acto knife. It works perfectly well for this project and it cuts through that XPS foam like butter. I'll be using this to not only cut the foam to the right size, but also make my initial cuts and markings for the design of my wall. I'll go more in depth on how to exactly do that in a moment. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of how to make this, we need to do another important step: research. Now, while this might seem like overkill to do research on a simple project like this, I find that it's good to prime my mind before I just jump into a build. To get some ideas, I'll often look at reference images of whatever I'm trying to emulate and make. In this case, I'm looking at different versions of bricks and stones at varying degrees of wear and tear. My goal here is to pick and choose pieces that I like, while also seeing what might work better than what I'm originally thinking. This is an option step, but if you're an over-prepper like me, then this is mandatory, as is overthinking every single little thing. Now, in the same vein of referencing and looking at research and being prepared, there does come a point when you need to just pull the trigger and start doing the thing and stop researching. So we've done our research, and now that we have the tools that we need, it's time to figure out the size and shape of the bricks and stones that we're looking to carve. This can be a little bit tricky, but I have some helpful tips and tricks that might help you. Sometimes, having a piece of paper the same size as the foam with a sketch on it can help. It acts as a sort of reference as you work on carving the foam. I made this little sketch with some of the research images that I found online. And remember, this doesn't have to be exact. It's just so that you can glance at it and references as you work. Later on in this project, I actually made a mistake, and I didn't realize how straight my lines were to the edge of my paper template. I must have moved the ruler as I drew the first line, which caused the rest to be a little off. But that's okay. You can either redo your sketch, or correct the mistake on the foam itself as you go, or you can do what I did and just add some stones to the bottom of the wall to hide my error. It doesn't really matter, because in real life, walls sag and lean, and as time goes on, they can start to warp and fall apart. Yeah, don't even worry about it. I totally did that on purpose, just, to make it more realistic. I never make mistakes. Never. Now, if you're like me, you might be a bit worried about scale and making sure that your wall doesn't look either too big or too small within your diorama. I had this super tiny soldier, which I'm not going to be using with this wall, but it's an easy way to show you what I'm talking about. See how much bigger the wall is than the man in scale? This wall would normally come up to a person's shoulder at the most, but if you look here, it's almost double the height of the man. I do want to mention one other tool that I didn't earlier, and this is what we're going to be using to actually shape the bricks and stones to give them the shape that you want. I tend to lean on two items when I do this. One of them being a little plastic clay shaper tool, and the other a set of metal shaping tools. Both of these are pretty inexpensive, coming in around $5 to $10. I use these to create spaces between bricks and stones in my walls. I also use it to etch in scratches and imperfections, and even press the bricks into the foam to give it a neat recessed look. While these tools are quite handy for creating bricks or stones, you don't need these specifically to succeed. You could also use a pencil tip or a ruler or even toothpicks to carve and shape the foam as you go. Alright, so we have our foam, our tools, and inspiration. Let's make this happen. I know a blank block of foam can be a bit daunting, but this is where the fun starts.
This is where the fun begins.
Now, I want to do a combination of both bricks and stone for my wall. The hobby knife lets me make clean, shallow cuts in the foam to start making things out. This is where that handy sketch outline comes into play for reference. Here, I'm doing the horizontal cuts for the brick. I ended up using my ruler as a straight edge to ensure that my cuts were lined up nicely. And remember, you don't need to cut super deep here. I only went about a third of the way up my blade as I worked through this. Next, I'm working on the vertical cuts, and I'm being careful not to go too fast. Otherwise, I risk cutting through my nice horizontal cuts and accidentally messing up the look of the bricks. After knocking out the brick portion of the wall, I move on to the stone portion, which will be the base of my wall. Because the rocks are all irregular and aren't in nice neat lines like the bricks were, I have to work a little bit slower, but I have a little more freedom with my X-Acto knife. I found that a useful tip is to sort of pull the blade through the foam rather than try to force it forward. I also found that an up and down slicing motion helped to get around the curves and awkward edges with the stones. Obviously, do what works best for you and your project, but remember, it's not a race. And I actually found myself enjoying the methodical progression across the wall as I worked. Now that both the bricks and the stones are etched into the wall with my hobby knife, it's time to go back and create the space between everything. For this, I'm going to be using one of my dental tools with a flat edge, and I'm going to run that between the bricks. This first pass will start to create the space that I want between each brick layer. And I already know I'll need to go back through a few more times before we paint this up to ensure that the spaces are wide enough. Now I swear that I used the gray clay shaper tool that I mentioned, but I cannot for the life of me find the footage, so you're just going to have to take my word for it. I used that to help create space on the horizontal lines for the bricks. I did get too excited about adding some of the details to the bricks and decided to work on that before etching outlines on my stone base. One of the best ways that you can add character to your brick wall is to tear out a few bricks, like the deteriorated or maybe got shot out by bullets. For tearing out the bricks, I used the tip of my hobby knife and carefully dug out the full bricks or maybe even partial bricks to add to the whole look. Another great technique to distress your wall is to press some of the bricks further into the wall to create some interest in imperfections. For pressing in the bricks, again, I use my dental tool and I just press some of the bricks down carefully. When doing either of these techniques, be sure to space things out and randomly pick bricks. The human eye is incredibly good at picking out patterns, so try to keep the damage as random and as natural as possible. Otherwise, it may not look realistic. Now that I've scratched my damaging etch, it's time to get back to etching in space between the stones on my wall. As I work my way across the wall, I'm trying to round my edges more so that they look more organic, as opposed to the bricks. The bricks have a flatter face to them, but I want the stones to be more rounded. Again, this will likely take a few passes to achieve the look I want. I do want to mention that you can use just about anything for these steps. It could be a credit card for the horizontal brick spaces, and a dull pencil tip for the stone etching. Don't be afraid to switch between the tools that you have. You don't have to stick with one tool the whole way through. In fact, I would suggest switching it up, and that can help you make the wall look more realistic and not so perfect. Alright, so we've made our initial cuts, and you've got some 3D detailing in there already. Next, I want to talk about some ways that you can texture your brick and stone to make it look more realistic. And hopefully you'll be able to use some of these on any of your other projects, not just brick and stone walls. To give the carved foam bricks and stones a more realistic texture, I'm actually going to be using a broken toothpick and a crumpled up piece of tinfoil to create indentations, lines, and rough edges that resemble the texture of bricks and stones. You want to break that toothpick in half to give one side a textured, fractured end. This is going to help you better mimic the texture for bricks. The good thing with this step is that you cannot really mess it up. The variation allows you to create a natural looking weathered effect, and if you need, you can look back at your reference images of real bricks and stones for inspiration and guidance. I'm using the toothpick to stipple texture all across the bricks. Now I take my rolled up ball of tinfoil and I press and roll that into the foam and across the wall. I do this both to the bricks and the stones, but I press a bit harder on the stone portion. I roll back and forth and sometimes just press the tinfoil ball into the foam, which I've found creates quite the convincing texture. Also, if you mess up, no one's really going to know. I decided to go back through and work on creating more space between my stones and accidentally took out a whole chunk of my wall. And you know what? I actually think it looks better than it did before. And no one's the wiser. The wall is looking great. We have a good texture, interest, but it does seem to be missing a final touch before we get ready to paint it. Capstones for the top of the wall. And to texture this, I'm going to take my handy little tinfoil ball and I'm going to sort of mash and roll it over the top of the foam. I'm pressing in a bit to create quite a textured, flat stone look. Now I realize that my fat hand is in the way of the shot, but it's the same technique that we used to texture the bricks and the stones on the wall itself earlier. Something else that I found to be super helpful is to take a toothpick and roll it around the edges of the top stones, or any bricks and stones for that matter. You'd be surprised how little pressure and effort it takes, but this really helps to round the edges out and make them look more weathered and natural, not as sharp. As you can see, here at the top stone on the left has much more of an organic rounded edge when you compare it to the top stone on the right, which looks more cut with sharper edges. Once that's done, I'm going to glue it down to the top of my wall with PVA glue. I'm just using this in Elmer's here because I'm basic. I first dry fit the stones by simply placing them on top of the wall to make sure that they fit and look right. Next, I just work my way across the top, gluing down one top stone after the other. I like the Elmer's glue because it doesn't dry and cure immediately, which means that I can shift the stones a bit and make sure that everything's lined up just how I want it. With the shapes and cuts and weathering done, this whole thing is looking great.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
Now that we have our foam cut, shaped, and textured, we're going to move on to the painting portion. I think painting is one of my favorite parts of any project. It really brings the project to life, brings some color into the scene, and you don't need anything fancy for this specific project. We're not going to be using airbrushes or oil paints or anything crazy like that. So you should be able to do this with the stuff that you have around you. Now I'm going to start by adding a couple of colors to my wet palette that I know that I'm going to be using for my base coats on the bricks. My first layer is going to act as a sort of primer for the other colors to sit on top of. And because of this, I'm choosing a darker red color for the bricks. And as you can see, I also mixed in a bit of brown as well to help add some depth and deepen that red even more. It's important that you get in all the nooks and crannies of the foam so that you don't have any of the bright foam color showing through, in this case, the bright green. If you find that you're using a lot of paint but not covering much area, try watering down the paint a little bit to maximize that coverage and also get good paint flow. If you need help finding colors or need ideas, I usually look at reference images to help. Next, we're going to go do the natural stone portion of the wall, which makes up the base. The primer step is going to be the same as it was for the bricks, but instead of a dark red color, I'm going to be putting down a darker gray to give it that stony look. This dark gray base coat will actually consist of Vallejo's Azure mixed with a little bit of black to give me this nice, cool stone color. And again, I'm mixing in a bit of water to help with paint flow, and I'm applying this to all the stones along the base of the wall. I'm also being sure to get in all the nooks and crannies too, so that none of that harsh green foam shows through. Something else that might help with getting good coverage on either the stones or the bricks would be to go back through with a second or maybe even a third coat of paint. This helps ensure that you get everything covered and primed up for our next steps. After I let the base coat on the stones dry, I'm going to be doing some wet blending with my next layers. Now wet blending is where you layer wet paint on top of a previous layer of still wet paint. This creates a cool blending effect that is more natural since the colors and pigments flow together to create the perfect blend. For the wet blended layers, I'm using some lighter gray and some tan as I blend on my wet palette to get various shades and values. I don't really have any rhyme or reason, and I'm not working towards a specific color in mind. I'm just looking to get something that appears natural for the stones. Next, I will come in with a touch of black to create shadows and some lighter tan to create some highlights. I'm being sure to focus the black shadows towards the bottom of the stones and the recessed parts, which helps create some depth, and I'm going to be focusing my tan highlights towards the tops of the individual stones, as well as on any extruded stones that might be getting more direct light. If you notice, When I apply the black shadows and the tan highlights, they appear very dark or very light. Now we want to leave that effect, but only at the lowest and deepest parts of the shadows and only at the highest and tallest parts for the highlights. To make this look more natural, we'll be using that wet blending technique to achieve a nice transition from the dark bottoms to the light tops. Now that the stones are done, I'm moving back to the bricks and I'm going to start adding the individual brick colors. Now this is going to look a bit vibrant and out of place at first, but you got to trust the process. While I've seen bricks with grays, browns, oranges, reds, sands, and flesh colors, I'm trying to keep this manageable. So I've chosen a handful of colors and I'm mixing them with each other in different combinations to get a good variety of colors. As I work my way across the wall, I'm not really working in a specific pattern. Rather, the goal here is to break up the flat, single-colored wall with variation. And by being a bit chaotic in your color placement, you create more realism. I'm actually also going to leave a few of these bricks plain with the dark red base color. Something I almost forgot to include was painting the top stones. This was super easy and actually only required 2 steps. The first being a base coat with that dark gray, same as we did for the base stones, and the second step was giving the top stones a wash with a light tan. This sort of dustied up the stones so that they didn't look so stark. So here we are. Paint job is done. Green foam color is gone, and now we only have 2 steps left. Now I know the colors look bright here, but don't you worry. We're about to fix this in the next steps by filling in the spaces between everything with some scale grout. Now, I've never made scale grout before, but I have seen a number of hobby people do this on their channels and work on their projects, and they usually have a different combination and a different way that they do it. After doing a bit of research, watching a few videos, and seeing what people used as their ingredients, I found that most commonly people used 50% grout and 50% sand to make their mixture. Now I actually did a little test sample on a small piece of foam that I carved up just like I did my actual wall. I wanted to test out this part on a piece that wasn't my actual project. That way, if I messed up, I don't have to fully restart the wall, or have my ginormous ego crushed by the fact that I couldn't even make a proper grout mixture. Now, after getting all the grout in place and removing the excess, I then applied my homemade scenic glue to lock everything into place. And if you'd be interested on seeing how I make my scenic glue, I'd be happy to make a video on it. Just let me know in the comments below if that's something you'd like to see. To get a more accurate placement of the glue, I did use a little dropper. Now don't worry if it pools and gets all over the surfaces of the bricks or the stones. I let it alone and it slowly seeped into all the cracks and sand mixtures over time. As you can see here, my test piece turned out quite nice. I didn't dab up any of the glue on the surface of the foam, and as you can see, it leaves a nice bit of plaster dust on the surface of each brick, which I like. Now with my little experiment concluded, I am going to move forward with the 50-50 mixture of the fine sand and grout for my actual wall project. But remember, you don't have to do it this way. You can test and try different things, and if you find that one mixture works better for you, go with that. It's your project and you want it to look the way you want, so do what you got to do. Also, because this works for me, it may not work for you. You may be looking at this and thinking, Samuel, that looks horrible, and that's okay. This is my project and I like the look of it, and if you have yours and you got a different mixture and that's what's working for you, do it. You want it to look the best that it can, and that may not be the way that I'm doing it. Now, if you have a better grout making process, I'd love for you to share it with me and your fellow mini crafters in the comments below. I'm always looking for new ways to do things better, and who knows, there may be others who are also looking for tips and tricks on how to do this exact same thing. Now you might be thinking, Samuel, I've carved the wall, I've painted the wall, and you had me add grout. What more could I possibly do? Well, I'm glad you asked, favorite viewer. The last thing that we can do is weather this bad boy up and call it good. Now don't feel like you have to do this last step. If you want a clean looking wall that looks like it was just built, you're done. Good for you. But I want to weather this bad boy up, and I love to weather. I think it really ties things together, and if you can make everything look kind of dilapidated and broken, seems kind of cool to me. There are many different options when it comes to weathering for any project. Now I've laid out some things that come to my mind when thinking on how to weather this wall. I've got pigment powders, scale leaves, and fine turf. Now I've gathered all this over a couple of years, so don't feel like you have to go out and buy everything you see here. And even more than that, I'm not going to be using everything here. Actually, the only thing I'm going to be using is this little moss deposit effect and some white spirits. For 99% of the weathering, I'm simply going to be using some thinned down acrylic paints to achieve the look that I want. I'm going to be starting with a heavily thinned white to add some white streaks in a few spots. This is going to further enhance and complement the light grout residue left behind on the surface of the bricks. Next, I'm going to be taking a heavily thinned black and streak that across the wall as well. I'm doing this in thin lines and applying a little bit at a time. Remember, you can always go back and add more streaks, layers, and colors, but it's always harder to remove paint if you add too much. And when you're thinning it down as much as we are here, it can be next to impossible. These diluted paint streaks create the general buildup of dirt and grime. But for more distinguishable grime and deposits, I'm going to be needing to use a slightly thicker paint. I'm also going to focus on adding more at the base and up and under the flat stones, as this would likely be where more grime and dirt would accumulate. I let this dry, then I water down some dark colors, usually a mixture of brown with a bit of black, and this is where that grout texture and unevenness is really going to shine. I'm randomly dabbing the watered down paint along the grout lines to darken those cracks and shadows. You don't need to evenly apply this. I'm taking a more random approach and only hitting areas that I think look a little too clean. Now I'm going to call the bricks and stones good, but I can't forget about the top stones. I hit the top stones with a watered down dark green color, and this creates the illusion of moss deposits in a damp environment. You may want to go back with the second time with a second wash to get the look that you're after. Next comes one of the more minor effects, but one that in my opinion really packs a weathering punch. We're going to be adding lichen spots to the top stones. And to do this, I'm going to take a nail, or something similarly shaped, and get some watered down tan paint on my brush. I quickly wipe it against a damp paper towel to remove any excess paint. That way we don't get any paint globs on the wall. From there, I hold my nail above the top stones and I take my brush and sort of wipe it down towards the wall across the nail. This creates a flicking motion that will speckle the tan paint across the top stones. I am sure to apply this sparingly as I don't want to overdo it. I then get some light green paint on my brush and I wick it off on the paper towel like we did with the tan, and I'm going to do the exact same motion and flick that green paint to add a speckling as well. The speckling creates a really convincing lichen effect that I think is going to be the perfect touch here. Now up to this point, I've only been using acrylic paints for all of this weathering, and as you can see, it's working out great. However, I'm really excited to try out this moss deposit effect that I picked up from AK Interactive. It's the first time I've ever used this specific product, and I'm really excited to give it a whirl and see what happens. Before I do this, I do want to touch on oil paints and enamel-based effects, just like this moss deposit effect I have here. While oil paints are great in their own right, you typically need to have them thinned down with an enamel thinner or white spirits. And you want to be extra careful when using an enamel thinner, as it can sometimes melt or damage XPS foam. But hey, if you're a baddie like me and you like to take risks, go for it. There are two ways to add this last touch, and one of them does not require the moss deposits effect from AK Interactive. To do this without the moss deposit effect, you could make a gross green mixture of acrylic paint and then water it down a bit. From there, you could slowly glaze it onto your foam wall. I would like to try to focus on areas that moss would likely grow, which would be the base, near the ground, and up under the top stones where it stays damp. The second option is to use the moss deposit effects from AK Interactive. The only thing with this option is it has an enamel base.
If you're a baddie like me and you like to take risks.
This works super similarly to the green acrylic paint options, but instead of using water to thin the paint prior to applying it to the wall, with the moss deposits, you apply it to the wall and then you use the white spirits to thin it down and spread it out a bit. Once dry, it's going to leave a nice mossy tinge to the wall. And once you get this part done, and like how everything looks, you can call it done. Man, I don't know about you guys, but getting to work on a build like this after a long day can be definitely relaxing. Also helps with practicing new techniques, and you get a sick little wall out of it. that's a wrap for this one, guys. If you liked the content and enjoyed the video, consider leaving me a like or subscribing. It goes a real long way with helping get my videos in front of new people and new viewers. Also, be sure to leave a comment below, as I'll be replying to all of those. That's it for now, so until next time, keep on crafting.